Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today, we're thrilled to welcome General Karen Gibson. Karen Gibson has nearly 40 years of experience in intelligence, cyberspace, and security roles, culminating her military service as Deputy Director of National Intelligence at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She previously served as Director of Intelligence for U.S. Central Command, Director of Intelligence for Operation Inherent Resolve, the multinational coalition to defeat the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, and as Deputy Commanding General for U.S. Army Cyber Command. Ms. Gibson also led intelligence operations centers in Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, and East Africa. Following the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, Ms. Gibson was asked to serve as U.S. Senate Sergeant at Arms, where she worked across the legislative and executive branches to rebuild the Capitol's security programs and restore faith in the Senate's security. She was responsible for many functions there, to include the Senate's technical, communication, and cybersecurity, as well as a broad array of installation support services for the Senate community. Well, welcome to Tipping Spears.
Thank you, Hannah. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So where does your story begin? And can you tell us kind of what first sparked your interest in serving in the military?
Yeah. So my story begins in Montana, where I grew up. It's changed a lot in half a century, but at the time, I was living in a small college town in the Northern Rockies, dirt roads, no McDonald's. It's not like that anymore. And I loved science. I was good at math, and I wanted to be an engineer. So I applied to Purdue University, which is a great public engineering school in the United States. And when I was accepted, my dad said, "Congratulations, that's a terrific school. How are you going to pay that out-of-state tuition?" And he encouraged me to consider ROTC. So I applied for and got an Army ROTC scholarship. I can tell you that, growing up in the 60s and 70s, joining the Army was not something that little girls dreamed of. I really didn't even ever consider it as a career. I think women were only allowed at West Point when I was late in high school. So it wasn't on my radar as something as a career, and it wasn't something I planned to do. I was just going to do my 4 years to pay back, the tuition that the Army had paid. And then I was going to go on and have a real life, a real career. My first duty assignment was in Alaska. It was a very harsh physical environment. I loved it. Coming from Montana, it would be 50 below without the wind chill, and we slept on the ground in a tent without the stove on. It was also a very unforgiving professional environment, but I found that I was actually pretty good at it. And by the time that assignment was over, there was nothing I would rather be than an American soldier. I hadn't planned on making this a career. It wasn't something I had thought about, but I just thought how serendipitous that I could fall into a career field that just satisfies and challenges me in every way. It really challenged every facet of my being physically, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, as a leader, and really leading teams was one of the things that truly floated my boat. I loved serving alongside other men and women who were similarly committed to doing something, to serving the nation, to being part of something meaningful. And I just found that to be tremendously satisfying.
Wow, your passion for service to our nation just exudes. So thank you for that.
I was grateful to have the opportunity. And really, there is no greater honor than leading America's men and women in uniform.
So was there a particular event or person that served as a catalyst for your career?
Well, I don't know if I would think of this as a catalyst for my career, but I would like to highlight one of my early leaders. So, I've mentioned that it was a very harsh environment in Alaska, and certainly physically it was. And we did PT 300, well, not 365 days a year because we didn't do PT together on Saturdays and Sundays typically, but, we went to the field, we operated in just incredibly harsh physical conditions. but it was also a very harsh leadership environment. Today, there's an expression we might use, which is a toxic leadership
Mhm.
environment. My battalion commander was very unforgiving, and he had a temper. By the time I arrived as a second lieutenant, he had fired every intel major in the division but one, and there were captains serving in major slots. He would scream, he would curse, turn red. I mean, he put a hole in the wall during a training meeting that was there forever as kind of this sign of, what happens when he's upset. And my lieutenant friends in other units at Fort Richardson kind of had the same stories. One of the infantry battalions, there was a battalion commander that would stand on the conference room table to yell at people. And if a field grade officer wanted to show you something was serious, they'd throw something, typically, a helmet, a canteen, something handy, that would show that this is serious and I'm ticked off. And I thought that this was normal. I'm a second lieutenant. What do I know about the Army? My thoughts and impressions of the military, growing up in rural Montana, far
Mhm.
from a military base, were very
Mhm.
shaped by Hollywood. Today, you
Mhm.
would say social media, but we didn't have that back then. And so, I would think of Gomer Pyle or
Mhm.
McHale's Navy, which it may not be
Mhm.
references you even understand, but they were always getting yelled at.
Yeah.
And if you watched some World War II movie, there was a lot of yelling there. And the
Mhm.
only female role model I think I had was Goldie Hawn in Private Benjamin, if you've ever
Yeah.
seen that, where
Yeah.
she low crawls through the mud with the rifle and the drill sergeants yell at her. So I just thought this was normal.
Wow.
And one day I failed an arms room inspection. I was still a second lieutenant, and I had to go down the street to battalion headquarters. And
Mhm.
I just thought the world was going to end.
Mhm.
And I walked in to see the battalion XO, Major Ron Burgess. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't use any vulgarities. He just very calmly told me how professionally disappointing this was and what I was going to do to fix it. And I should back up and say, when my battalion commander would yell at me, because he yelled at everybody, you would just kind of think, screw you, buddy. What a
Yeah.
jerk. I'm going to go out and do this just to prove you wrong, you
Mhm.
blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
Well, when Major Burgess very calmly discussed my professional failings, I
Mhm.
walked out of his office feeling 2 inches tall because I had disappointed him. And
Wow.
it was very revelatory to me to see this contrast of leadership styles and to see how powerful it is to be a leader who inspires because
Mhm.
people admire and respect them and want to do well and want to please them, as opposed to being a leader who forces people to do things through fear. And there's, again, a very powerful contrast. And I decided that I wanted to model myself after Major Burgess, not my battalion commander. It was a wise choice. Major Burgess went on to become a three-star general and the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I met and worked for many other very good
Mhm.
leaders in my career. But it was an interesting way to start. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to also see what right looks like, because many
Mhm.
people raised in a toxic environment will think that's how you're supposed to lead
Yeah.
and model those behaviors later in their career. So
And
I've always, even when I was a battalion XO, I would think, what would Major Burgess do? It's great to have good role models like that.
that's such a great example. I think you make an excellent point about how if that's all you're exposed to is the negative, kind of the fear driven, adult temper tantrum level of leadership, you may think that's normal. And what an amazing example.
Mhm.
So I know every journey has its hurdles. Can you tell us what some of the biggest obstacles were that you faced in your career and kind of how you overcame them?
Sure. We all face professional hurdles and
Mhm.
challenges, and we find ways to work through those. I think the one that I would share was more personal. Certainly, my greatest hurdle in my professional career, um, and that deals with disappointment. So, I joined the Army in 1987. I was pregnant during Desert Storm. It kind of wouldn't have matched, so I couldn't deploy.
Yeah.
And I was stationed in Alaska, and aside from the 82nd Airborne Division, none of the light fighters were used in that war. And then I was in Korea for 9/11. I didn't leave until 2004. I was doing important work. It was an amazing assignment, but I really desperately wanted to be part of the fight in Iraq and Afghanistan. I was confident I would get to deploy, but when I
Mhm.
left Korea, my assignment officers had other plans. They sent me to
Mhm.
the Pentagon to work in the Army G3. Then I was a
Mhm.
battalion commander, a job I really wanted, very meaningful, but it was stateside. Again, here it is now. It's like 2007, and I still have never deployed. I was a lieutenant colonel out of battalion command, and I thought, how can I lead people without having had this experience myself? So I finally got the chance. I was very excited. I went to Fort Bragg, and I was going to be a deputy Corps G2 at 18th Airborne Corps, and we were going to deploy to lead the three-star headquarters in Iraq. Very
Mhm.
important. And as part of our screening, they check your teeth, you get anthrax shots. And
Mhm.
because I just turned 40 recently, they suggested I get a mammogram. And,
Mhm.
I'll cut to the chase and say it turned out I had stage 3 cancer and had no idea. So obviously not deployable. And I began chemotherapy the week the Corps
Mhm.
staff deployed on the advance party.
Mhm.
It was devastating to me, not just, to have cancer and then this, 16 months of sometimes pretty grueling treatment,
Yeah.
just a lot of things that go on there. But to know that this thing that I wanted more than
Mhm.
anything professionally, and frankly, the first oncologist who broke the news to me, and one of my first questions was, "And when can I get to Baghdad?" Because I thought, like, you could do some things real quick and then just like cut it out and just send me. And he
Yeah.
said, "Oh, you're not going anywhere for 5 years." Which turned out
Wow.
not to be true. I went doctor shopping and I did deploy twice in those 5 years, but it took me about 2 years. And I thought, here's this thing that I want more than anything, and it's not going to
Mhm.
happen. And I thought my career is over.
Mhm.
Even if this doesn't kill me, life as I know it is over. Obviously, that's not what happened. But
Mhm.
it was a deeply transformative experience
Mhm.
to go through this for about 18 months. And I didn't like hearing about it at the time. I didn't like it when people would say something good will come of this, but it
Yeah.
did. And I like to think I am a better person as a result. And obviously, I did later deploy and my career didn't end. But I thought about this a lot during the pandemic, frankly,
Mhm.
when when the world goes totally sideways and
Mhm.
things that you think are going to happen to you or your family or society or whatever are just not going to be. And I felt,
Yeah.
my heart broke for high school seniors who were going to be the captain of the basketball team or someone who just got their big break on Broadway or opened a little shop on Main Street and then the pandemic hits. And I think that, when our hopes and dreams are dashed like that, we grow when we are challenged.
Yeah.
And if we can look at the environment, and it's hard, but acknowledge that what you thought was going to happen is not going to be,
Mhm.
there are opportunities. And if you can adapt, retool, refit, and take advantage of those, you can have a
Mhm.
bright future. But people who cannot let go of what they
Mhm.
thought would happen, of the way they thought the world was going to unfold, have a very hard time. And I'm sure we can all think of examples during the pandemic or other circumstances where people have been able to adapt to
Mhm.
unexpected circumstances that took their life in a different direction, and those who could not. And I
Mhm.
think it's a sensitive question, and I apologize for getting so personal. But when I think of the biggest hurdles in my career, for me, clearly that one was at the top.
Mhm. No, that makes sense. It's very, very understandable. I love how you describe, well, one, how open you are with like, it did impact you. It's the fear of like, is this it? Like, is this the end of the career? What's going on? I had on my 36th birthday, I had a bad mammogram result. They got it
Um,
early, but I mean, it like I just remember when they told me because they were doing
yeah.
and they stopped it to tell me, which is like,
Oh, wow.
yeah, and it's just like, all the doctors come in, all the nurses. I mean, I'm just it's like life
Yeah.
just stops. And then
Yes.
I thought I was there for something else. It's like and one thing that just impressed was, is life ever gonna be the same? Is this just it?
Yeah.
Like, did the road just end here? And
Right.
then everything that I was going for, like I was working with special forces folks, it's all dudes. I'm the only
Yeah.
one who's kind of like eye strapped to my chest,
Yeah.
like, going through this. Just like
Yeah.
it's unnerving, it's destabilizing. And it really resonate with kind of how you outline that
Yeah.
experience. And then you do, it is kind of like a crossroads with,
Yes.
are you going to let it just stop here? Is this the
Right.
excuse for like, that's why my career went this way, or
Right.
or are we, going to look at the alternative path? And you
Hmm.
described it so beautifully. And it's
Well, thank you.
something that I think folks don't
Yeah.
you don't think about it till it hits you kind of
Until it
upside the
happens
head.
to you. Yeah, exactly. And everyone has their own compelling stories. I think the
Yeah.
last thing that I would share, survivorship affects different people differently. But for me, the overwhelming, enduring lesson, career aside, was
Yeah.
tomorrow is not guaranteed. So let's
Yeah.
double down on today.
That's a great perspective.
Yeah.
So, as director of intelligence for CENTCOM, you managed everything from clandestine operatives to exquisite space-based collections. How did you approach decision making when the stakes spanned, a big region from Egypt, Pakistan, and
Yeah.
all these different things?
Yeah. I love that question. I love to talk about decision making. I realize we're limited on time. I could talk about this for an hour, but I'll try to keep it to a couple minutes and just hit some high points. I think the first thing regarding decisions is let's identify and acknowledge what decisions need to be made. That isn't always obvious, but what are the decisions that I need to make and what can just kind of proceed as it is and be on the lookout for the sudden decisions you have to make that you weren't anticipating. And then who can make which decisions? It's very important that you understand which decisions you're going to reserve at your level and that your subordinates, the people that work for you, know which decisions you expect them to make, which ones they can make on their own, which ones they
Mhm.
make and just keep you posted about what they're doing, and which are routine. And I have seen an environment where you have someone like my first battalion commander. If you chew people up when they make decisions you don't like, they're going to stop making decisions.
Yeah.
They will freeze. Everything will come to you. It results in paralysis. So if you empower people to make decisions, unless it's illegal, immoral,
Mhm.
unethical, grossly unsafe, you need to, if they make a decision you're not crazy about, perhaps there's some coaching afterwards about how we might have approached this differently. But if you expect people to make decisions, let them know that and then let them make those decisions. That's really important. A specific example for who can make which kind of decisions in a combat environment is target engagement authority. So
Mhm.
when I was in Iraq and Syria, deliberate pre-planned targets, typically against installations that ISIS was using, that was a one-star decision. The J3, who
Mhm.
vetted the targets, would decide these are things that we can strike. You didn't have people at lower levels who just decided out of the blue that they could explode certain buildings. I mean, there was a hierarchy and everyone understood it. Occasionally, there would be targets that we had to elevate. For instance, we wanted to go after a gas oil separation plant in eastern Syria that ISIS was profiting from tremendously, but there were a lot of Russian workers there, and we didn't want to at that time tick off Russia. And so that target, we actually had to go to the Secretary of Defense. It was a special category of target that required his approval to go after. Then, when I was at CENTCOM and we blew up some of the chemical infrastructure that Bashar al-Assad was using
Mhm.
to use chemical weapons against his own people, that was a presidential decision. So people have to
Mhm.
understand what kind of decisions they're authorized to make. You need to make clear to them what you expect them to do on their
Mhm.
own, when they can let you know, and then don't go after them if they make a decision they were authorized to make and you didn't
Mhm.
agree with it. I think a couple more points I'd make on decisions is one, you also, or I guess this would be three, you need to know when to make the decision, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes if you make it too soon, you don't have enough information. Sometimes you make it too late, it's not enough time. When we do military planning, we have things called decision points that kind of tell us when you have to make the decision in a military
Mhm.
campaign. You might think of it like in your personal life if you've applied to a couple of colleges or your kid has,
Yeah.
and maybe they've been accepted by three. You could decide as soon as you get all of that information that I'm going to go to VMI, for instance.
Mhm.
But there's also a time when you must decide by, or it's too late to be accepted at those. So understanding when you can make decisions. And then you have to be comfortable if it's time comes to make a decision and you don't have enough information, you have to be comfortable making decisions without a perfect picture. I'll
Mhm.
use as an example when we evacuated the CENTCOM headquarters in the face of Hurricane Irma. It was a Cat 5 hurricane that was threatening the entire state of Florida. We couldn't wait until we knew whether Irma was going to hit Tampa or not to decide to vacate the headquarters. Because if we waited until we knew, it would be too late to leave. And there were people who were not comfortable making that decision. It was very expensive. We couldn't
Mhm.
just shut down the headquarters and hang up a sign. We had to relocate people to Qatar and Missouri and Washington, D.C., and get an alternate headquarters going before we shut down the one in Florida. But we had to make that decision in the face of uncertainty, because if you wait until you know everything, it's often too late to do anything. I think those are some major things about thinking about decision making. What decisions need to be made? Who is authorized to make them? When do they need to be made? And being comfortable making them in the face of uncertainty, because you will often, in fact, I would say in a combat environment, hardly ever have all the information you'd really like to have before you have to make that decision.
That's a great overview. I love how you hit kind of those paralysis points that
Yeah.
folks encounter with decision making. And sometimes I think people think, oh, if I just don't make this decision, the damage will be less. Or maybe the damage won't be less, but it won't be my fault, right? It's
Right.
like that.
And that's why it's important that the people on your team, on your staff know you expect them to make these decisions. And I would be very clear at times, these are the areas where I reserve decision authority for myself, to
Yeah.
wake up criteria often, call and wake me up, and then we'll figure out what to do. But it has to be clear to the staff who's expected to do what. And,
Mhm.
and and in those areas where you have not reserved decision authority for yourself, where you expect
Yeah.
someone below you to take care of it, you expect them to execute, to demonstrate disciplined initiative,
Mhm.
to achieve an intent that they understand because you've communicated it, and they know the left and right limits of what they're allowed to
Mhm.
do and when to inform you or push it higher. So it has to be a shared understanding at every
Mhm.
level of this decision making apparatus, as well as an accompanying an information system where you're communicating what's happening on the battlefield or somewhere else that enables people to make the appropriate decisions. I think we did this very well at Central Command headquarters.
Mhm.
I was fortunate to work for General Votel there,
Mhm.
General Joseph Votel. He's writing a book right now on his leadership philosophy that's called Command and Feedback. This is a part of that. I can't wait to have his book on my shelves once it's published. But we had a very, I think, robust, mature, frequently exercised system by which people understood the decisions they were expected to make at their level, and they were simultaneously communicating the information that was needed for decision at every level appropriately.
Mhm. It's great. I look forward to reading that book too. So
Yeah.
add it to the reading list.
Hmm.
So you've led intelligence operations fusion centers in Iraq, Afghanistan, Korea, Africa. What are the most defining leadership lessons you learned in those, high pressure environments that I'm assuming has a lot of uncertainty. You don't always get
Yeah.
all the information.
Right. Yeah, so this is one I could talk about for an hour. I enjoy speaking with businesses about leadership imperatives in crisis.
Yeah.
And I won't, go into that whole 45-minute pitch, but just hit a couple of high notes.
Mhm.
First, as a leader, it's so important to stay calm.
Mhm.
The staff is gonna, you know that energy, positive, negative,
Mhm.
whatever, is contagious.
Yeah.
And it's important to stay calm. You could be very focused, hyper focused, but to stay calm. The staff, the rest of the team expect you to provide clarity and to communicate. And so, just at all times, calm, clarity, communication. So a couple of imperatives I would say for making decisions or leading in a crisis. One is to prioritize. When the crisis hits, that becomes your focus, to understand what's vital, urgent, and important that you need to focus on, kind of letting other things go, whether that's, more routine scenario, ignoring the flood of emails, which
Yeah.
calls are you going to take, which aren't, which functions do you suspend or put on hold? When we moved CENTCOM headquarters in the face of Hurricane Irma, there were certain things that we had to delegate to others, like
Mhm.
managing ISR across the entirety of the theater. We delegated that to the air component, to AFCENT. There were
Mhm.
other things that I asked the joint staff to perhaps take on for us. And which things are we going to still take care of? And which things are we not going to do at all? Like, while we're evacuating for this hurricane, we're going to stop planning for a leadership conference. We're going to stop, upgrading the HR system, or, stop routine computer security training. So you've prioritized the functions that you're going to perform. And we've already talked about decision making, who makes which calls, when to make the call, making the call, even when you don't have all the information. It's really important to communicate. Here's what I'm doing. Here's what I know, what I don't know. Acknowledge that, what we're doing, what to expect, and I'll get back to you. And most people are pretty good about communicating with their higher headquarters. It's very important to communicate laterally or to key stakeholders as well. And I'll give you an example. When I was the Senate Sergeant at Arms, and I realize we haven't talked about that yet, I had so many bosses. I used to say I worked for 135 small businesses, that being 100 Senate offices and 35 committees. And I had in a crisis 26 people who expected to hear from me right away. Various national security
Mhm.
advisors, the majority and minority staff, the majority and minority leaders, chiefs of staff,
Mhm.
various senators and appropriations or rules or other committees. And rather than think about this every time something happened, I walked around with in my iPhone, a draft email that was already teed up but had no body, that had the 26 email addresses. So that I
Oh,
didn't have to
wow.
stop and think about
Yeah.
who's the new national security advisor? Did I remember to add Hannah Becker? It was just always locked and loaded. And I would just type
Mhm.
what's going on and hit send and then reply all. And when the crisis is over, I rebuild a new one. So you've got to communicate laterally. And then, really importantly, communicating with your own team. And that's when people often forget. And as I was sending these updates to Senate leadership and key stakeholders, um, you know, about every third one, I would draft something very similar and send it to
Mhm.
my own team, so that everybody knows, because everyone wants to know, what are we doing in this crisis? It's not just
Yeah.
hire. And it might not be the same identical information that you're sharing, but here's what I know, what I don't know, what we're doing, what to expect. I will get back to you. I think I would highlight one other key thing that's important leading in an intense situation, and that is the need to take care of people by making sure that everyone has time to sleep, to eat, and a short period of a break to relax, to meditate, to
Mhm.
go for a run. It is very easy to neglect these things,
Mhm.
and you and your staff will collapse and become non-functional if you're not
Mhm.
taking care of it. It's not, so rudimentary, basic human needs, but I've seen many instances where people just don't take care of these things. They either underestimate how long a crisis is going to last and overestimate their own stamina,
Yeah.
or they think this issue is so important, I have to be involved in every detail, and I'm just going to stay up and take care of everything. And these are both fallacies. And this
Mhm.
is why before the crisis, you always have to be working on building the bench. Who's going to answer the phone or take care of things while you're crashed for a nap? Because you
Yeah.
cannot go without sleep. So, building the bench, making sure you have a resilient team that can fully participate while you're taking a break and that they're getting breaks too. Many times I've arrived in a deployment theater to find a staff that is just utterly exhausted, crisp,
Mhm.
fried, can no longer
Mhm.
function, and they've still got 90 days left. You've got to pace yourself and make
Mhm.
sure that not just you, but the rest of your team is taking care of those basic human needs that are required to
Mhm.
sustain your performance during a crisis.
Mhm. That's such a great reminder. I think all too often, kind of the exhaustion and the just like, spending everything and your energy kind of deposit to, at the expense of your own health is viewed as kind of like a badge of honor. Like you're the one that's working so hard. You're the one that's so
No,
committed.
I call that the false culture of martyrdom. And I
Yeah.
saw it as a second lieutenant in my first
Yeah.
duty assignment. People were measured by the hours that they logged in the office.
Hmm.
And as a second lieutenant, I just thought it was ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, we deployed to the field for a huge exercise. It was actually our biggest ever, and it was the hardest. It was the one where it was, I mean, we were setting record temperatures for the state of Alaska. It was
Oh,
crazy. There were
wow.
fatalities. There were frostbite injuries in our S3 NCOIC, the NCO that was responsible for operations for the Tactical Operations Center,
Mhm.
had to go on emergency leave days ahead of time. And, the other NC, they couldn't find things. We didn't load the convoys right. We get out to the field, we're missing key equipment. And everyone was talking about, his first name was Sam. So it was, Sergeant Sam, so great. How, look, we can't operate without him. I thought that was ridiculous. I thought this isn't a
Yeah.
sign of how great he is. This is a sign that he's failed to train
Yeah.
anyone else on the team to fill in when he's not
Yeah.
there. And
Yeah.
and I'm sorry, I hope I'm not going on too long, but the same exercise, I was the second lieutenant, battalion S2, and I'm doing more than 12-hour shifts, maybe 15-hour shifts, but I could also take 15 minutes to run over to the chow tent and grab an
Yeah.
MRE for lunch, or the hot tea rats, they were called, for breakfast or dinner. And I'd come back in the talk, and the S3 would look at me so mournfully, this major eating from an MRE, and he'd say, "What did they have?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'd tell him whatever, it's not that enticing, but I'd tell him whatever's on
Yeah.
the menu." And he'd be like, "Oh, it must be nice." And I just looked at him and thought, if you don't have 15 minutes to go grab chow, this
Yeah.
is a sign that someone on your
Yeah.
team isn't prepared to pull their weight, not a
Yeah.
sign that you're essential. I mean, it's
Yeah.
it's such a fallacy. I have seen this, and it's something we have to fight against.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know you said that the fight against ISIS required, tight integration between intelligence and operations. Can you tell us what people often misunderstand about how intelligence, shapes combat outcomes?
Oh, intelligence absolutely should be part of every aspect of combat operations. Operations and planning, I would add that too. We're kind of talking about operations, but planning as well should always be informed by intelligence. It's why doctrinally the intel officer briefs first before you talk about ops. It's why Annex B comes first in the operations order before the details of how you're going to conduct the operations. Intelligence is required for early warning, looking deeper than the commander can in the
Mhm.
campaign, in the theater, to identify risks to the campaign, to
Mhm.
identify opportunities, to anticipate requirements. And so I'd like to hit on two things here that are really important for that commander and the staff that are being supported by the intel team. And the first is they have to understand, you have to make known to everybody what your strategy is. They
Mhm.
can't look deep and far and identify key things for you in that infinity of information that is sometimes
Mhm.
available if they don't understand your priorities and what you're trying to accomplish. And one of the best commanders that I ever worked for, General Joe Dunford, he later became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in Afghanistan. And he came in to be in charge in Afghanistan. I was a colonel running the Intel Operations
Mhm.
Center at his headquarters. And prior to that, I had not been privy to the kinds of discussions of, what the commander was trying to accomplish. The commander and key staff would go in a little room, shut the door, a handful of generals, and then
Mhm.
it's kind of like electing the Pope, and then the door opens and they kind of give you some guidance, right? But General Dunford opened the aperture. He opened the door literally, and certain colonels were allowed to be in the room as he was
Oh,
having those
wow.
discussions. And now that I understand so clearly what when he would think out loud, and he's such a brilliant strategic thinker, and I understood what he was trying to accomplish. General Botel was the same, General
Mhm.
Townsend, Steve Townsend, who I worked with in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now I can look at all that information that's out there and say, I need to tell him about this. That can
Mhm.
wait. I don't know how to fill his read book. I don't know what goes in
Yeah.
there if I don't understand his strategy. And so that was really important. And one of the many things I learned from General Dunford. I would say also the Intel team needs to anticipate potential requirements that haven't perhaps been explicitly articulated. And I'll use
Mhm.
as an example when we had the opportunity when I was at CENTCOM to go into Pakistan potentially. JSOC would have conducted the operation and
Mhm.
rescue an American woman, Caitlin Coleman, who'd been held captive by the Haqqani for several years. And we became aware of an opportunity that potentially we could go in and get her. And it was going to kick off in about 96 hours. So I need to brief the status of Pakistani air defense systems. how the Pakistani Air Force might respond if we go into their territory, where their jets are, how long it's going to take. When you get that heads up that you might be able to do this operation in 96 hours, that is not the time to say, huh, I wonder what Pakistani air defense is like. You had to have been looking at it all along.
Mhm.
Another example, when I became the CENTCOM J2, I had a binder behind my desk called Syria Response Options. And it was that binder that we drew from when we conducted the strikes on Assad's chemical infrastructure in the fall of 17. But it had been in the works. This is a binder, a book of options that had been built for a very long time. It took, in some cases, years of understanding and collection by NSA, CIA, NGA, and others to help us develop those targets. If you're not thinking about and anticipating what might happen, and of course, it's part of the planner's job, working with the planners to communicate that, then you're not going to be able to tee up options for the commander, as we were able to do for the president when he decided he wanted to take action. In a previous administration, when President Obama decided he wanted to do something in Libya, he turned
Mhm.
to the team, AFRICOM and others. Well, that's not something we're looking at. They weren't able to provide, options, and frankly, we didn't do anything in that case.
Yeah.
And it's not a judgment as to whether or not we should have. I think my point is the intel team that supports intel and
Mhm.
operations can know, an American intel team can know a lot about something, but they cannot know a lot about everything.
Mhm.
We cannot have that level of insight for the entire world. And so working closely with intel and operations always to be synced, to
Mhm.
understand that linkage is required for you to identify those risks and opportunities for them, to understand what they need to know because you understand what they're
Mhm.
trying to accomplish, as well as to prioritize what the intelligence team is doing. And those are just a few of the examples of how intelligence has to be synced with operations and planning. It also shapes targeting. By developing the BDA or battle damage assessments, you tell whether you need to restrike something. Did we destroy it? Do we need to go back? What's the status? What's left of Iran's nuclear weapons program? Intel absolutely has to be synced in order to support every aspect of operations and planning. And I used to tell my team, it isn't first, it isn't always easy. I have worked for people who either didn't have a strategy or didn't share it. I think it was more often that they just kind of didn't have a strategy and were just sort of making it up as they went along. Or times where, the intel team isn't trusted, right? If
Mhm.
if the planners
Mhm.
and the operators and the commander have to trust you implicitly, or all that work you're doing is for nothing.
Mhm.
It's really important to have and to demonstrate and sustain that trust that enables you to be tapped in like that.
Mhm. That's a great examples of kind of the integration and collaboration that's needed to kind of influence the outcomes there. I know you spent more than a decade, in cryptologic and cyber roles, and later became Deputy Commanding General of Army Cyber Command. What did cyber leadership require that was different from, traditional intel or military leadership roles?
I love this question. I will tell you, Hannah, I don't think the leadership is any different, right? There's still soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, still
Yeah.
human beings. It looks like ones and zeros, but it remains a fundamentally human endeavor. And
Mhm.
the same principles of leadership apply. You provide, meaning, direction, and
Mhm.
purpose. You inspire and motivate. You
Mhm.
train, you resource them. You've established standards. You make sure they're clear, communicated, and consistently enforced. And then you're conducting battlefield circulation or have other feedback mechanisms by which you understand the challenges they face in terms of resources, authorities, policies, or training, and you work to address those. That isn't any different, right?
Mhm.
So, what I did find, though, and what I found especially frustrating working in the cyber domain is not that leadership is different, because it's not, I don't
Mhm.
believe, but
Mhm.
the institutions that we operate in need to change. We are operating with 20th century industrial era institutions and
Mhm.
processes, and they lack the agility that's required to execute in a rapidly changing digital
Mhm.
domain. And I'll cite two examples. One was procurement. And I think we've made a lot of improvements here. But when I was a battalion and brigade commander, I had a little organization within my organization. First, it was called Detachment Meade when I was a battalion commander. And then as a brigade commander, it was the Army Net Warfare Battalion, later the
Mhm.
744th MI Battalion, and then the 780th Military Intelligence Brigade. And they had um, the job of executing certain kinds of offensive cyber operations. And the tools that they were going to use, now they're NSA tools, but they were also Army tools. And if they were Army tools, well, that's a weapon system. And there
Mhm.
was a program executive officer who worked procurement of those tools, just like the program executive officer who works procurement of tanks and joint strike fighters and a new pair of boots, following the same federal acquisition regs, the
Mhm.
same, where I put the and I remember going to a conference with the Army G8 who said, from the time your requirement is approved until we bend metal, that's a key word, bend metal, is going to be, I think it was 7 years, 8 years, 6 years,
Yeah.
whatever. In a digital
Yeah.
world, that isn't going to work, right?
No.
One, we're not bending metal. And by the time, if you're going to follow that process to field an offensive tool, I
Mhm.
guarantee you, that router that tool is developed for
Mhm.
does not exist anymore, or the
Mhm.
password's been changed or whatever. So,
Mhm.
procurement was an example. And Cyber Command and NSA and others have done a lot to find more innovative ways of fielding those things. But another one would be training, right? So my
Yeah.
husband, he joined the Army in 1977. He's a little older than me. He was a light infantry officer, served from 77 to 99. And the most significant force modernization update he experienced was the transition from the M16A1 rifle to the A2, and maybe, a new radio system, right?
Yeah.
So for someone like him and these NCOs and officers I served with in the 6th Infantry Division in Alaska, here's the training model for an officer. You go to the basic course as a second
Yeah.
lieutenant. 4 years later, you go to the captain's course or the advanced course. As a major, you would go to Command and General Staff College. Now we tend to call it ILE, Intermediate Leadership. I can't even remember what it stands for, education. And then if you're really good, you'll go to the War College as a colonel. That's an industrial era training pipeline
Mhm.
that is not adequate for someone working in the digital domain. We need
Mhm.
if you're going to be a cyber warrior, that's a lifetime commitment to continual education. Certain
Yeah.
basics like leadership, I've just said some things don't change, but other things do.
Mhm.
And yet our institutions, many of our institutions are industrial era, 20th century. We really need 21st agile, digital
Yeah.
or agile institutions that are optimized to work in this rapidly changing 21st century.
Mhm.
Those are some examples. So to me, leading in the cyber domain, leadership is the same because
Mhm.
human beings are not changing. But the institutions that we often use for cyber warfare still need some changes to make them agile enough for that kind of
Mhm.
operation.
Yeah, that's a great description, a good assessment of a very changing dynamic environment. I love
Mhm.
the emphasis on procurement and training. I think all too often people forget those two things and they're just
Yeah,
like, we need the tech new now, not sure how that happens or how it gets implemented.
yeah. These are hard things. I don't mean to imply that
Yeah,
this is simple stuff, and it's especially
yeah,
difficult in an enterprise as large as the US Army, the US military.
yeah,
You can't just, not everybody can just employ a boutique solution.
yeah,
If you're smaller,
yeah.
like the Marine Corps or perhaps some of our special operations elements, you can do that. But to do it across an entire enterprise as large and complex as the entire US military is very challenging.
So how do you think intelligence needs to evolve, as our adversaries are increasingly using, hybrid, gray zone, kind of cyber enabled operations? There's just so much new stuff, coming at us from our adversaries. How do you think that impacts intelligence?
Yeah. You ask great questions, Hannah. I could talk for an hour on each of these, and I will try to exercise a little discipline and not do that. So, two aspects of this that I'm not going to dive into deeply.
Mm.
One, open source. I think open source information is the intelligence discipline of the 21st century. I'd love to talk about all the ways I used it in Iraq and Syria for every aspect of the intelligence cycle.
Mm.
I'm a huge believer in it. Not everything you
Mhm.
see is true, and even less so
Right.
now that we have,
Yeah.
deep fakes. You kind of have to treat it like human intelligence. What's
Mm.
the source? How reliable is it? But you can't ignore it. You absolutely can't ignore it.
Mhm.
And then as a result of this, it's really an infinity of information that is out there because it's
Mhm.
more than we can collect. We collect more than we can process. We process more than we can analyze. We analyze and produce more products than anyone can read, digest, and act on. It's an infinity of information that really cries out for still what we used to call advanced analytics. Now I'll throw in a little AI, but something to rapidly infer knowledge from that vast quantity of data. Your question was really kind of, and okay, and I'll throw in one other that is kind of, I think, eternal. I've already mentioned it. We can't look at everything everywhere. So we have to prioritize in accordance with a strategy. I've contrasted our ability to rapidly, I mean, within days,
Mhm.
take action against Bashar al Assad versus an
Mhm.
inability to do something in Libya. We have to
Mhm.
have a strategy. And if the strategy isn't clear, or if the
Mhm.
strategy shifts a lot, or isn't communicated, it makes it very hard, even with these tools of advanced analytics and open source, for
Mhm.
the intelligence community to provide the information that's required. I think one other thing I'd mention, actually a couple more, you have to be asking the right questions and
Mhm.
looking at the right things. So I'll cite another example of my experience with General Joe Dunford, again, one of the
Mhm.
best commanders I ever worked for. So when he showed up in Afghanistan, we had, as a staff, for several iterations of commanders, been collecting all kinds of information, primarily about violence. So, and we had
Mhm.
armies of ORSs, operations research systems analysts, number crunchers. We could create heat maps, pie charts,
Mhm.
histograms, troops in contact, IEDs, what time of day were the IEDs, what kind were being used, how many people are killing, where are they, et cetera. Just, vast quantities of data related to violence in Afghanistan. General Dunford was there about 2 weeks, maybe three, and he kind of shoved all those papers to the side and said, I don't care about that. Let
Mhm.
them, we're all gassed. I mean, this is what we've been doing for like forever. It's like a giant Willy Wonka machine with all these knobs and dials of everything that we're collecting. And he said, I don't care about that. Let them worry about that at the 3-star headquarters. That's their fight. They're the tactical headquarters. He said, what I want you to tell me is the confidence of the Afghan people in their government. It's like, wow. It just, that is the right
Yeah.
question. That is the strategic question. And frankly, I would say, had we been able to really answer that question, that lack of confidence and faith in the Afghan government by the Afghan people is ultimately why the Afghan army collapsed in the face of the Taliban many years later. But that's what he wants to know. That's the right
No.
question. But I don't have some like popular sentiment pod that I can put on the bottom of a drone and fly over villages and measure it. How am I going to measure that?
Yeah.
So the first thing is to ask the right questions, and then make sure you're collecting the information that would answer that. And we tend to be
Mhm.
really good at counting stuff and hardware. We were keeping track of all these
No.
explosions, where they happened, when, by
Yeah.
whom, et cetera. Or, we can count aircraft, where they are, when they're flying, operational performance data. We're not real good at measuring the soft stuff, that sentiment.
Mhm.
And to your original question about hybrid and gray zone operations, that's really a lot of what we need to know.
Mhm.
Frankly, the Department of State is an entity that can help answer some of
Mhm.
those questions. It tends not to be the military intelligence industrial complex. Human sources are hard to build. It takes a
Mhm.
long time. Of course, there are other ways to get at sentiment now in terms of social media or other kinds of open
Yeah.
source collection. But human sources and human sentiment is hard. It tends to be under resourced. It's often the
Mhm.
first to be cut in terms of force structure.
Mhm.
And it's not particularly lucrative, right? So,
Right.
we have these big defense primes, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, et cetera. They don't go rolling up to a headquarters and say, hey, I heard you're interested in some deeply vetted human sources in Pyongyang. I think I can deliver. There's no request for RFP out there for like, give me someone who knows what's happening in Tehran. And so,
Yep.
so this is hard to get at in a hybrid gray zone. And the American way of war, which is incredibly precise,
Uh-huh.
powerful, lethal, minimal casualties, is not optimized for collecting that kind of stuff. So I think, to kind of summarize my answer to your question about intelligence support to hybrid and gray zone warfare, first, having a strategy that's clear, that doesn't shift a lot, that's well communicated, understanding priorities, clearly
Hmm.
articulated priorities. We can't look at everything everywhere.
Hmm.
Asking the right questions, ensuring
Hmm.
we have the information that can answer those questions, applying advanced analytics or AI, having a multidisciplinary approach, because
Hmm.
again, our standard military ways don't always, means of collection don't always readily answer those, is really kind of what's needed to best get at those kinds of challenges.
Yeah, that's such a great example. I'm going to remember that with Afghanistan and asking the right question. I feel like, especially in the age of technology, you can chase information for eternity. And
Yeah,
if you're going after the wrong thing, I mean, this can just go on and on and on and on and on. And to
right.
your point, what a great example
Yeah.
with
We tend to
Afghanistan.
put the cart before the horse and say, hey, this is stuff I
Yeah,
can count. How
there you
can I
go.
use, and
Can
it's not just in intel,
yeah,
it can be in HR or operational
yep,
decisions. What can I count and how will that help me answer my questions?
yeah,
Not what are the
yeah.
questions I should ask? And then how do I get the information that will answer those?
That's true. That's true. So I know you retired from the Army a few years ago and were asked to become the U.S. Senate Sergeant at Arms. Can you tell us, about that role and what it's like protecting a democratic institution in a time of intense, division and digital risk?
Yeah. So I love this question. Again, thanks for asking it. I didn't know anything about the Sergeant at Arms before I got there, really. I mean, most people have never heard of it. And I tell folks, I'd go to a networking reception, a cocktail party, whatever, and people say, oh, who are you? What do you do? And you
Yeah.
say, oh, I'm a Sergeant at Arms. No one ever says, me too. Or like, oh, I thought about that. Nobody. It's just not on anyone's radar. So if you'll indulge me, I'll start with a little history lesson. The term is rather archaic, and it's hard to fit on job applications or resumes. Frankly, my full title was Sergeant at Arms and Doorkeeper of the United States Senate. It's a
Oh,
mouthful.
wow.
It's a little archaic. It dates back to medieval Europe, frankly. And Richard the Lionhearted took sergeants at arms with him on his crusades as his personal bodyguards. And one of I don't know if it was
Oh,
Henry V or someone, was the first to put a sergeant at arms in the British Parliament to protect the parliamentary body. And that is the origin of our term. And it is a term that is used in parliaments around the world and at US capitals. And really, it was that person who is there to protect that institution. So, and now I'm really going to dig into history here. Article 1 of the Constitution, that's the legislative branch, it
mhm,
says the Senate will appoint officers as it sees fit. And so when we started to operate under the Constitution, which was not until
mhm,
1789, because before that,
mhm,
we were trying this Articles of Confederation thing that didn't
mhm.
really work out. I think it was April 6th, 1789, the Senate chose James Mather as the sergeant at arms. And the next day they chose a secretary. And a month later, the House chose their sergeant at arms. And then in August, we inaugurated George Washington as our first president.
Mhm.
You know what that means? It means we've had a Senate sergeant at arms longer than we've had a president of the United States. Just a bit of
Oh,
trivia there if you're ever on Jeopardy. So anyway, so James Mather, he had three jobs, and the Senate was actually in Philadelphia at the time. And
oh,
that was watch the door, which is the origin of the law enforcement role of the sergeant at arms, who is the senior law enforcement official for the Senate, to collect firewood, provide firewood for the stoves that kept the Senate warm. And the Sergeant at Arms still does that because people like to burn fires in the historic fireplaces of the Capitol,
oh.
and to take care of the horses, which we no longer do. But the Sergeant at Arms does run the motor pool, the shuttle fleet, and parking enforcement, et cetera. I figured James Mather probably had a couple of stable boys to help him muck out the stalls. And he would be astounded to know that it's 1,000 folks now, and they do everything
Oh,
from the barber shop, the page dorm,
yeah.
passports, running the post office, the television studio, basically all the stuff that
Mm,
allows the Senate to operate on a daily basis, to include the security role, not just for the US Senate, but for the 450 state offices around the country, and their leases, their furniture, their communications, and their security. And communications is really the one that I think James Mather would be astounded, is because, of
mhm,
course, we didn't even have radios back then, right? But the Sergeant at Arms also runs all the communications for the US Senate and is responsible for cybersecurity. And that was a
oh,
huge part of the role there. And in fact, what I worried about most, from a security perspective, because the cyber threat is constant, it's evolving, it's very sophisticated, it requires constant vigilance and adaptability. It was the biggest part of my budget, and a third
mm,
of my staff of over 1,000 folks, more than a third of them were in the CIO or the CISO to secure the
yeah.
Senate's communications. Part of your question had to do with, leading in politically fraught times or
Mhm,
securing the Senate. I would say I was a little worried about working in a political environment, having come from
mm,
a apolitical, career in
yeah.
the U.S. military. Um, it was not a problem in the Senate. Not in the years that I was there. I
Mhm,
had to respond in the Senate. You respond to both the majority and minority leaders.
mhm,
You really don't do anything that one of them disagrees with. So I had to
mhm,
confer constantly with the Schumer and McConnell staffs. And
mm,
while they have very differing legislative agendas and domestic priorities,
mhm.
even foreign priorities, I would say, what they asked of me was the same thing. And I was never
Oh,
caught between the Democrats and
yeah.
Republicans in that regard. I was very grateful to have good working relationships with both teams, and they had good relationships with each other. And as I mentioned, they always, the two sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, really asked the same thing of me. And that made my life a whole lot easier.
That's fascinating. You are the first U.S. Senate Sergeant at Arms that I have met. So I
Yeah,
love the
there
history.
aren't a lot. I think I was the 42nd ever, and most of
Oh.
them are deceased. So yeah.
I know, that's fascinating.
Mhm.
So you've devoted nearly 4 decades to public service. What would you tell someone, who wants to serve their country, they want to do something meaningful, they're not sure where to start? Do you have any advice for folks that may find themselves kind of at that juncture?
Yeah. I say go for it. I mean, we need public servants. We all
Mhm,
benefit from public servants, and if it's not full-time employment in that regard, I hope that people are finding some way to serve their communities, right, and the folks that they
mhm,
live with. There's a whole world out there. Of course, there's the military. That's not available to everyone, and it's not
mhm,
something that everyone is interested in. There's also law enforcement. I never
mhm,
considered law enforcement. I did briefly toy with the idea of joining the FBI when I was a young captain,
mhm.
but when I worked as the sergeant at arms and
Yeah.
and was a law enforcement official, boy, every time I interacted with Chief Conti or Chief Carroll at
Mhm.
the Metropolitan Police or Chief Tom Manger in the Capitol Police, I wished I'd been a cop, right? I just thought, wow, this whole world that I didn't know about
Yeah.
that looked really exciting and rewarding. Of course, there's USA jobs, but if it,
Mhm,
which people who want to work, in public service, you can't ignore that. I
mhm,
think a couple other things I would suggest. One, talking to people who work in government or have worked in government, conducting
mhm,
informational interviews to find
mhm,
out what's out there. It's far more
mhm,
than what you read about in the paper.
mhm,
How to get in, who else you might talk to, working your alumni networks. Excuse me. But the last one I think I want to mention, there tends to be a focus on the federal government. There are
mhm,
all kinds of needs and opportunities at the state and local levels. So, I had a former colleague who became the director of emergency services in California. If you think that's not a high pressure job, between
mhm.
earthquakes, forest fires, atmospheric rivers, there is something going on every day in the state of California that requires an emergency response. I have another former colleague who is now the state cyber official for the state of Texas. States, more and more states have this position, and then an entire staff that falls under them. And
Yeah.
so I think state and local is an area that doesn't always come to mind, but what a
Mhm.
great opportunity to continue to serve in sometimes some very fascinating ways.
Mhm.
I have a friend, who's last, it's kind of federal, but her daughter got an internship at I think it's the NTSB, the National Traffic Safety Board, and
Yeah.
is like an XO for the head of it. And holy cow, so maybe it's not the NTS, I think it's the NTSB, whether it was the horrific plane and helicopter crash over
Yeah.
Washington National Airport, or, a train derailing in Palestine, Ohio. She is on the road all the time with this guy looking at things around the United States. There are so many opportunities, and we are all
Yeah.
made better when bright, energetic, motivated Americans choose to work in those areas.
So, from your vantage point now, what do you think is the biggest misconception that policymakers or senior leaders still have about cyber risk? I know y'all were
Yeah,
addressing this with the Senate with a
I would
30-vote
throw,
staff.
yeah, I would throw business leaders in there as well, right? Because,
Yeah.
90% of critical infrastructure is in the private sector, and
Mhm.
small businesses and municipalities are really among the most vulnerable to cyber threats. And I think one of the biggest misconception, I would say, particularly for businesses, is when they see cybersecurity as a cost center, not as a source of competitive advantage.
Mhm.
And in particular, when you think about your ability to, say, safeguard your customers' PII, and what happens when a company fails in the cybersecurity arena in terms of regulatory backlash, perhaps very costly judgments in a lawsuit, the money that's spent to fix it, the reputational damage.
Mhm.
You really need to see it as, strong cybersecurity posture is a competitive advantage over
Mhm.
businesses that do not have it, not as something, a cost center that you reluctantly fund.
Mhm. That's a great perspective. I think you hit the nail on the head as far as how business leaders are looking at it, and you brought up some great points. Things like reputation that can last for years.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So, General Gibson, do you have any final words of advice or parting thoughts for the audience today?
Well, I've been talking a long time, Hannah, and I appreciate your patience and your terrific questions. It's been a lot of fun. I would say thank you for having me on here. I did not seek a career in government or national security. It wasn't something that crossed my mind as a young person.
Yeah.
I really had no idea, but what an amazing ride, exciting, challenging, deeply rewarding. I wouldn't trade my career for anything. And I appreciate the opportunity to continue speaking about these topics, particularly leadership and decision making and things that apply across every industry that's out there. It's not just about, the classified intelligence community. And I hope that these remarks and the platform that you provide have an opportunity to both educate and inspire folks. I would thank any of your audience members who are already engaged in national security or public service. That's an an essential part of keeping America strong. And I would thank you, Hannah, for providing this platform and for your passion and enthusiasm for these projects.
Oh, well, thanks so much for taking the time to come on and sharing your insights and experiences. It's so inspirational and insightful to hear from someone who's, a little further along in the journey and have that feedback. So, your contributions to our nation have impacted so many, and we appreciate you so much with that.
Thanks, Hannah.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Tipping Spheres. We hope this conversation has sparked new ideas and challenged the way you think about our future. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.